Welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Mariana Marques, president of Azimuth World Foundation and your host for this episode. In a rapidly changing world, the urgency to protect nature is undeniable. The climate and biodiversity crisis affects us all, but its impact is particularly acute in Africa and all of the global south. Recent studies reveal a staggering 69% decline in wildlife populations between 1970 and 2018, a stark signal of the sixth extinction primarily driven by human activities like land use, resource exploitation, and pollution. However, there's an uncomfortable truth we must confront. The climate change and biodiversity crisis, largely caused by the West's lifestyles and consumption patterns, disproportionately affects communities in Africa and all of the global south. Despite contributing minimally to global carbon emissions, these communities bear the brunt of environmental disasters and extreme weather events. And that's not all. In the West, we often envision conservation through romanticized images of pristine natural landscapes inhabited by charismatic megafauna. These visuals of these animals' lives and the looming prospect of their imminent extinction presented in HD photography and 4K documentaries evoke powerful emotions and sometimes a sense of guilt and complicity in the destruction of nature, leading to generous financial support for conservation organizations. These conservation organizations often displace communities by creating pristine nature wildlife reserves or parks, and thus conservation refugees expelled from their ancestral lands. Ironically, it is these very communities that have conserved the areas through their lifestyles and ancestral knowledge of the land and ecosystems. Even more ironically, this further contributes to the loss of biodiversity. Financial resources continue to pour into international organizations establishing protected areas, and we continue to fail to fully understand the intricate complexities at play. By doing so, we perpetuate the cycles of exploitation and colonialism that have ravaged and plundered the indigenous communities who have stewarded wildlife habitats since time immemorial. We support outside actors who arrive to take control and manage Africa's resources, perpetuating a pattern where the West seizes control over regions and communities far removed from their own, further marginalizing the affected populations. Conservation is exceedingly intricate reality, deeply entangled with the history of colonialism and the global capitalist market. Its geopolitical implications and impact on local populations should not be underestimated. While the concept of protected areas appears deceptively simple and universally, it masks a complex, at times violent and corrupt reality. Stripping away the powerful myth-making machine surrounding conservation requires a candid and unflinching gaze into its inner workings. Guiding us on this journey to explore the path of decolonizing conservation is Dr. Abby Sen, a distinguished faculty member in Parks and Conservation Area Management at Clemson University, South Carolina. Dr. Sen is a trained interdisciplinary environmental social researcher committed to advancing social and ecologically fair approaches to managing public lands, natural resources, and cultural heritage in both the US and Africa. Her groundbreaking research delves into the intersections of parks and protected area governance, livelihoods, nature-based tourism, and the relationship between race and nature. For over a decade, Dr. Sen has collaborated closely with government agencies in the US and Africa, contributing to the formulation of integrated management plans for vital conservation areas of global significance, addressing the critical nexus of biodiversity and socio-economic development. With her extensive writings on the colonial structures of power in conservation, Dr. Abby Sen has shed light on essential issues that demand our attention and action. We are eager for our listeners to join us in exploring her extraordinary work as it inspires all to embark on a transformative journey towards decolonizing conservation. Dr. Abby Sen, thank you for being with us today. To start, could you share with us your journey into conservation and how you began questioning mainstream ideas surrounding conservation in Africa?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mariana, and the Azimuth World Foundation. It's really an honor to join you today on this very important conversation. Thank you again for the invitation. So my journey into this work that I'm doing now in biodiversity conservation, both in Africa, but also in the US focusing specifically with African American communities. It really started during my road trips growing up throughout West Africa, family road trips with my dad, my father, and my sisters, my parents. I'm a national of Senegal. I was born in Senegal, but we lived in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ghana as well. So most of my trip were mostly concentrated in West Africa. And we visited several national parks on each of those, all of those road trips. And that's where I really begun taking a keen interest in biodiversity conservation in general, right? The idea of parks and protected areas was through those travel, visiting those national parks. Also, while I had this notion of protecting biodiversity, I also did understand the centrality of how local communities are able, actually cared for that land and their deep connection with the wildlife through a lot of those road trips that I was taking. The ways in which they were working the land, they cared for the land, right? The ways in which they also were able, for example, or had a deep knowledge of wildlife, right? Using their own languages to describe wildlife movement, but also being able to predict seasonal patterns based on some of that, the wildlife that they were observing around them. And so those were my transformative years where I started gaining an interest in both conservation, but also in development, right? It wasn't just that I had a keen interest in wildlife conservation alone, but I also had a deep interest in rural development, having also witnessed some of the issues, the socioeconomic issues that some of these communities were facing or subjected to. When I went to college, I was very much interested in understanding how can biodiversity conservation or the preservation of our natural resources also work for, as a catalyst for rural development or developing some of those communities. And so that's when I took on environmental economics as my major in college, realized that economic models were not really capturing some of what I had, experienced or also even witnessed during those trips. So then I moved on to ecotourism and nature-based tourism, for example, right? Because again, protected areas were really stood out in my mind as a model for biodiversity conservation. And so this was really the journey that I had taken on going into parks and protected areas, a central piece to both leveraging biodiversity conservation, but also rural development, right? That is really the paradigm that I had bought into. It wasn't until I did my dissertation research in Senegal, or even prior to that, when I had observed, for example, conflicts between farmers. I will never forget one time when I lived in Ghana, where the newspaper came up and said the farmers are looking to, threatening to burn a national park. And that was really an awakening moment into understanding what has driven these farmers, right, these villagers to want to burn the national park or burn the forests that were enclosed in the national park, right? What has driven this aversion towards this national park, right? These are the people that have cared for the land, and now the complete flip to want to burn it. And this is when the questions started to arise in my mind, and realizing how conflictual Western model of biodiversity conservation that has been imposed on the African continent, right? How in conflict it was with the African-centered or African models of biodiversity conservation. So those are two very divergent model, and this is when I really started exploring both both of those paradigms to see where the conflict arose.
Well, and that takes me to my next question, actually. So the post 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, commonly known as 30 by 30, aims to set aside 30% of terrestrial cover for conservation by 2030. What are the implications of this initiative for Indigenous communities, and what's at stake under the guise of biodiversity conservation?
Yes, and so plain and simple, the plan to expand the number, or to double, I should say, the coverage of protected area by 2030 will result in dispossession, right? That is the most fundamental and concern that we have, right? So there is going to be mass displacement, right? We've already started seeing it, for example, with the Maasai community last year, who were threatened, who are currently facing massive eviction. It was about, I think, 70 to 80,000 Maasai people in Loliondo and Ngorongoro conservation area, and the world has witnessed the violence of conservation then, right? But the Maasai are not a unique case. I mean, they're a classic case, but they're not a unique case. Throughout the continent, there are particularly pastoralists who are being either forced to sedentarize, but who are also losing grazing land and their ancestral land in the name of conservation. Fishers are also losing fishing grounds in the name of conservation, right? And farmers too, and hunters, right? These are Africans who have deep connection to those land, whose livelihoods are being threatened right now under the name of conservation. What is very alarming to me is the pace at which it is going to happen, right? Like, if we think about the first national park or protected area was Yellowstone National Park, and that was in 1872 in the settler colony that is called United States today, when the indigenous communities were forcibly removed to establish protected areas, right? So that has opened up a wave of protected areas in much of the colonial world and further dispossessing communities. There has been an estimation that there were around 110 million people, indigenous people, who have been displaced, indigenous and local native communities that have been displaced as a result of the establishment of protected areas, right? But that has been over 150 years. Now imagine trying to double that number within 10 years. And so, yes, the scale at which and the pace at which the dispossession is going to happen is quite, it's very concerning. And it's already resulting in indigenous rights violation. It's already even resulting in indigenous murder, right? Murders of indigenous environmental activists. I mean, there was Global Witness has reported that it was in 2020 where there's been about 200 indigenous environmental activists who were murdered from the global south, and all of those are related to wanting to fight for their to retain the rights to those land.
But many conservation projects claim to be community-centered, incorporating community education and even participation. However, you've discussed the two implications of community-based natural resource management and its impact on indigenous self-determination. Can you share your insights and give us some examples so we can also understand the connection?
Yes, absolutely. So to really understand community-based natural resources, the context of it all, it's important to also place it historically and what are really the major factors that led to the emergence of community-based natural resources. And when I say community-based natural resources, it's the same as community-based conservation, or conservancies, as they call it as well, right? So there are different iterations, but basically community-based natural resource management or community-based conservation, which I will call CBC from here on now, it's that hereafter, is that it gives a space for the local community to manage conservation projects, right? And there are different ways to do that. Or not only to manage conservation projects, but also to be able to benefit economically, right, from conservation projects, right? You know, CBC projects really started to emerge as a result, you know, because of two global factors, right? It was first, it was really the backlash against forest conservation, right? That forest conservation leads to further impoverishment. Forest conservation is also dispossessing. It's dispossessing local communities, but it's also really severing their ties to their ancestral land, right? And it has also resulted in backlash in terms of retaliation by local communities, as I had explained with that anecdote earlier, you know, when the farmers had threatened to burn the national park, right? And so it became very counterproductive, but it was also because of indigenous resistance too against forest conservation in throughout the 70s, 80s, and so on, right? And so that was one push towards community-based conservation or community-based natural resource management. But the second factor was that also the realization that indigenous communities also play a critical role, or I should even say are fundamental, right, to biodiversity conservation, right? They, through their livelihood practices, but also their spirituality, right? Like people we're finally recognizing that indigenous communities are the reason why these landscape became, you know, were so well preserved, right? Through their own their own indigenous natural resource management system. It was in the Rio Summit, right, in 1992, the UN Environmental Summit the Rio Summit of Rio de Janeiro Summit in 1992 that actually gave a greater space into the conservation discourse, you know, for indigenous communities. It was against the backdrop of the of that declaration, the UN Declaration of 1992, that CBC started to proliferate throughout Africa, and not just in Africa, but even in Latin America, in Asia. And so what happened was that there were some institutional reforms in protected area governance, right, in national parks governance, that that created community-based organization at the local level. And this community-based organization were in charge of representing the interests of the community, right, in the decision-making process of how those resources should be managed. So that's one institutional aspect of it. The second aspect was that there were also conservation projects, but also governments had to work together to create economic activities that would benefit local communities. And so this is when tourism became key, really started to gain a foothold in conservation, right? They started selling community-based tourism projects around national parks, saying, hey, you know, this community-based conservation projects benefits local communities, and it also serves to protect wildlife as well. Now, one thing, if you hear me, everything that I have described so far, right, is around economic benefit, right? How can we, and also institutional reform. One thing that is not that was thoroughly missing in the discourse was also self-determination for indigenous communities, right? Indigenous communities were very clear from the beginning that what they wanted was self-determination, right? The right to be able to benefit from those conservation projects, but also be able to determine what activities they were able to take on those lands. But what community-based natural resource management does is, sure, what we will do is create an institution, to represent, to be the voice of the community, right? But we are going to tell you what kind of activities you can take on those lands still. So there is no self-determination there. There's no sovereignty, right? And so while community-based conservation was a progress towards, including Indigenous voices into those spaces, it actually had not responded to the demands of Indigenous communities for sovereignty and self-determination, right? Being able to get that land back and being able to exercise their traditional right, their birthrights, right, of exercising those customary resource management systems that has actually preserved the land. It was, community-based conservation, how they were able to benefit from it was imposed by international conservation agencies.
You've said that sensational images can create misperceptions about land death and conservation. And you just referred a while ago to Maasai, and I was thinking about the recent Maasai evictions in Loliondo in Tanzania, for example. So what are the best ways and platforms to advance the discourse on decolonizing conservation? And what actions can people actually take to contribute to this movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in my piece in the Republic, that's published in the Republic, is Against Wildlife Republics. And the Republic is a Pan-African review that is based in Nigeria. So in there, I talk about the danger of seeing the Maasai case, or no, I shouldn't say the danger, right? It's very real, right? The violence against the Maasai is real, is raw, right? And so they were deserved to be exposed, absolutely. What I was trying to explain is that it could, however, lead to the misperception that that the violence had to be sensational, right, and direct in order to create the same outcomes of dispossession, right? So the military shows up, as we have seen in the Maasai case, and started to forcibly evict them. That was really a last resort, right? That was the last resort, because the Maasai community have really put up a resistance upfront for a very, very long time. What I was trying to explain is that we need to also pay attention to those instances where they're not, where eviction are not as violent as what we have seen in the case of the Maasai. What usually happens, right, is that there is the rewriting of environmental laws over time, right? There are different ways. You either rewrite environmental laws to actually be able to evict, right, to forcibly evict them, or what I call manufactured consent is state-sanctioned deprivation of those communities, right? You're starting, what the state can do is either withdraw public services, right, like schools, hospitals, right, water, for example, right, so that they create the conditions of impoverishment so that it's easier for communities to accept the relocation, right? That's what it's called, you basically manufacturing consent. And then they label it as how do you say, voluntary relocation. Right. And that's what happens in a lot of cases too. I'm seeing in for example, in the Casamance region, where in Senegal, where there are talks around carbon offset projects as well, which is a different form of conservation. It's all the same predatory practices, where people are conceding to carbon offset projects because, right, it is the only alternative they have. These communities are extremely impoverished, right? They don't have schools. They don't have, the schools are in poor conditions. the hospitals are in poor conditions. And so when you have a private actor, someone like Shell, for example, Shell Oil or BP that comes in and say, we want a carbon offset project with you or biodiversity offset project with you, we'll give you this much money. You have no other choice but to say, well, I will buy onto that project, even though it seems very nebulous. They have no other choice, right? Because it's the better alternative, even if it's not a good alternative, it's the better one. And so, that's what happens often in a lot of these cases. And so, what I was trying to explain by using sensationalizing is, the violence doesn't have to be sensational for it to produce the same violent outcomes over time, right?
And there's an often overlooked connection between protected areas and global extractive projects, and you just named a few. Can you help us understand this link and its transparency, or rather lack of transparency, to local communities and global audiences?
Yes, absolutely. So something that is often overlooked is how protected areas have actually become sites of extraction, right? The narrative at the beginning was that protected area is actually protected areas are actually the solution to extraction, right? Or is the opposite of extraction, right? You take land, you put it aside, and there's no extraction happening there, which is actually a myth, right? Because extraction still happen in protected areas. On the contrary, biodiversity conservation, right? Wildlife conservation is just a guise for further extraction, right? It's a guise to be able to dispossess local communities, right, without any public scrutiny, because really, who wants to fight protecting nature, right? Like, it's hard, it gives them a moral high ground for which to be able to give social license to the dispossession of local communities. But then somewhere 5, 10, 20 years down the road, they're able to give private concessions, right, to extractive industries to be able to extract on those land. And it happens, extraction, it's actually like logging, right? I talk about extraction, what kind of extraction? You have logging happening in protected areas, you have mining happening in protected areas, right? It was the Rainforest Foundation Mapping for Rights project actually maps in Central Africa, right? They are mapping right now all the private concessions that have been given to extractive industries within those places in Central Africa. So I really encourage everyone, your listeners to take a look at it. It's the Rainforest Foundation Mapping for Rights project. And so, but not just there, not just in Central Africa, I give the example in Senegal, where there's a lot of mining also happening in Nyokolokoba by Petowal mining industry within the park, Nyokolokoba National Park, right? And so there's mining, there's logging, but there's also the declassification of protected areas, right? Or part of it anyway, to be able to give it to agribusinesses. There's currently a battle at Jael Wildlife Refuge in the north of Senegal, where the government has degazetted about 2018, about 2,000 hectares of land from there to give it to an agribusiness in I think it's an Italian agribusiness, Senwil, to be able to have a plantation in that area, right? Like farm that land, which was protected area, when there are still active land claims by the local community to be able to get that land back, right? And so it's protected areas now have just become really an excuse to dispossess local communities and then place it under the auspices of the extractive industry, but also under the auspices of the all these African governments that are later on down the line going to sell that land to whoever, to the highest bidder.
Yes.
And that's what's happening too with carbon offset markets or biodiversity offset too, right? Like those are the people, the buyers of carbon offset of carbon offset projects are extractive industries.
Yeah, I was going to actually touch specifically that important point and subject, and how are protected areas being integrated into the global carbon markets, right? And what are the actual results in terms of halting emissions, deforestation, biodiversity loss, pollution?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's so carbon offset, it's a global extractive project, right? Like carbon offset projects, and biodiversity. So there's carbon and there's biodiversity offset project, right? It's basically plain and simple, it legitimizes the plundering of nature. That's it, right? It legitimizes the extraction of the ecological destruction of the planet. So the idea is you can pollute here, you can extract here as long as you go here and protect this land, right? Or plant so many forests or so many trees, and then that will offset whatever destruction you've done on this side. And so who are the highest bidders for those? Obviously they're the extractive project. Right now in Senegal, Shell, BP, Petowal are all on board with buying carbon projects in the south of Senegal on the mangroves. And so with the understanding that they are able to mine for gas, to completely deregulate too, it also gives them the green light to be able to take on ecologically destructive practices, right? And so it only accelerates, right? It doesn't resolve the issue because you are not stopping the ecological destruction, right? On the contrary, you are legitimizing it, right, by later on saving forests on this side, but even the economic models that they are using in carbon offset, actually the science that they're using to show that forest is actually offsetting the amount of pollution is completely bogus. It has been completely debunked, right? No amount of offset is going to completely, carbon is going to offset how much pollution, how much destruction has already been happening, right? And so that's one. But two, you are also, through this carbon offset project or this biodiversity offset project, you are dispossessing, you are actually removing the very people who have spent centuries protecting that land. It is not accidental that the land that is now targeted for protected areas are the very land that have been under the care, the stewardship of indigenous people. It is precisely because they have cared for that land that these lands are now some of the most biodiverse. You are creating or you are fixing a problem that does not exist on that land in the first place, right? These people are there to protect the land. Why are you removing them from that land, right? And all of that under the guise of conservation, but also all of that to further seed land for carbon offsets so that the global north or all of these extractive projects can continue the plunder of nature elsewhere. It solves no problem at all. If anything, it further accelerates deforestation. It accelerates, it also accelerates pollution, right? And it continues the violation, the violence against indigenous communities. And so the best way really to protect those land is to really, really fight for indigenous sovereignty on those lands, right? That is plain and simple. There's no other way. If conservation projects or if environmental projects are not centering the issue of indigenous sovereignty, then they're not working towards conservation.
We couldn't agree more with you.
Yeah.
And as an academic, are there robust groups of researchers working towards decolonizing conservation, or is it still a quite lonely pursuit?
Well, I would say that it's actually growing. It's let me say this. In conservation, wildlife conservation itself is it's still a lonely pursuit, right? But there are others outside of wildlife conservation, who are actually understanding how colonial still wildlife conservation is. And I've had to really go in those spaces outside of wildlife conservation to be able to make those connections. But in our field, in wildlife, in biodiversity conservation, it's still a bit lonely in a way, right? Not just but there's still the number of researchers recently that have contacted me, who are actually young. A lot of them are doctoral students who have contacted me and wanted, as a result of reading my work, has been very, very encouraging. But in academia, it's still very much, it can be very lonely. But NG, there are other foundations like yours, for example, outside of academia, I think it's where I have found the most fulfilling connections that I have made in that space, right? In decolonizing conservation space.
So kind of the last question is, what is your vision for a future of just decolonized conservation? Do you think it's achievable? Would you say that guaranteeing indigenous sovereignty is the essential first step in that direction?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no question around it. I think that the question of indigenous sovereignty, sovereignty over how to govern natural resources, how to benefit from natural resources must be front and center. Indigenous, but also local communities as well. I know there's a lot of, confounding of indigenous and local communities, but there are also political tension around that word. But I'm going to use that, indigenous and local communities just as a political umbrella, right? But the sovereignty over governance of, sovereignty of governance over natural resources must be front and center. And then after that, what comes after that is, how do you even protect, right? How do you create the conditions under which that sovereignty becomes sustainable, right? Because we can talk about land back, and we've seen it. We have seen land restitution to local communities who ended up selling that land. Why? Because of impoverishment too, right? Like, how do we also create the conditions under which that sovereignty remains, right? And that is also understanding, how do you improve the material conditions of indigenous communities so that later, when a predatory threat, when a threat is coming in or private interests are coming in, they are able to better negotiate the terms of that, those sharing of land, if possible, if it can happen at all, but also what kind of activities can be done on their land rather than forcibly or having no other choice but to sell that land because they don't have any other opportunities or economic opportunities. One thing is also completely decentering protected areas as a primary mode of conservation, right? Like protected areas in a sense that that is completely devoid of humans, right? Like indigenous communities on their land, right? They have for a long time have cared for sacred forests, sacred mangroves. Again, thinking about the Jola people in southern Casamance who, through their spiritual practices, right, have created their own protected areas. That is the sacred mangroves of Casamance are a perfect example. And there are tons of sacred spaces in there too, right? So indigenous sovereignty, yes, improving the material condition of indigenous communities, but decentering first and foremost, the Western model of conservation that has no vision for culture within those or humans within those protected areas, and recentering indigenous worldviews into biodiversity conservation.
Dr. Abi-Sen, thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights on decolonizing conservation, in particular in Africa. It's been an enlightening conversation, and we hope to continue following your extraordinary work. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been a very rich conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to Connecting the Dots. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out the podcast version or read the interview at azimuthworldfoundation.org/insights. Be an ally, stay curious. See you next time.